The desert does not forgive. It swallows sound, it blinds the eyes, it scorches the skin until even the breath feels like fire. In the spring of 1064, beneath a sky so white with heat it seemed to burn, two armies stared across the sands of Jerusalem. On one side, endless ranks, 40,000 strong. Shields glittering, banners cracking like whips in the wind, the thunder of cavalry hooves echoing like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, iron, and dust, the weight of inevitability pressing down on every man who stood there. And yet opposite them, in the blinding haze, stood only a speck. A square of men so small it seemed almost a trick of the light. 800. Hardened faces behind polished shields, their bodies wrapped in foreign steel, their axes heavy in calloused hands. The numbers alone should have decided everything. 800 against 40,000. A storm about to crush a candle flame. But as the desert winds howled, something was wrong. The smaller force did not tremble. They did not bow beneath the shadow of annihilation. They stood as if the desert itself bent around them, as if they welcomed death with open arms. Their lips moved in whispers, not of fear, but of prayer. And when they lifted their weapons, the sunlight caught them like fire. The earth trembled with the roar of an army 40 times larger, but history would not remember the sound of that roar. It would remember what came next, a slaughter so absolute, so impossible, that it would echo through centuries as one of mankind's most lopsided massacres. 800 Vikings would descend into legend. 40,000 would vanish into ash and memory. But the secret behind their victory wasn't steel. It wasn't muscle. It wasn't even skill. It was something far more terrifying. If this story already has you gripped, if the desert winds and the clash of impossible odds are pulling you in the way they pulled me when I first uncovered this tale, then I invite you to join us here on Cursed Chronicles. Subscribe now, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to hear is not just history, it's a curse that still haunts the echoes of time. But who were these men? Who were the 800 shadows that dared to defy 40,000 beneath the desert sun? To understand them, you must travel far from Jerusalem, back to the mist-draped shores of Norway, where a king named Magnus Barefoot ruled. Magnus was no ordinary monarch. He was a figure out of legend, a man who walked between worlds. He wore the garments of the Scots instead of the gilded robes of a king, earning him his strange name. To his people, he was the living echo of the old gods, fierce, unbending, as wild as the seas that lashed his homeland. Yet Magnus lived in an age when the cross had replaced the hammer, when Christianity had taken root in northern soil. For many rulers, that meant the taming of Viking fire. For Magnus, it meant something else. He did not see faith as a leash. He saw it as a weapon. From that collision of iron and prayer, of axe and cross, Magnus forged a vision. Warriors who would not fight merely for land or for plunder, but for eternity itself. Soldiers who saw death not as defeat, but as triumph. In them, the fury of the berserker would merge with the certainty of the saint. He would create an army that could not break, because they would not care if they lived. But vision alone could not shape such men. Magnus needed to find them. So his recruitment began, brutal and merciless. Not every Viking could be chosen. He searched among veterans scarred by decades of war, men who had stood knee-deep in blood and did not flinch. Each of the 800 had to prove mastery over axe and sword, endurance that could outlast hunger, heat, and pain. And above all, they had to prove faith, not the quiet devotion of churchgoers, but the burning certainty that they were God's executioners on earth. Magnus broke them down, then built them anew. Their training was relentless, unlike anything their forefathers had known. The old Viking way was chaos, each man fighting in his own storm of fury. Magnus demanded discipline. He brought in Byzantine mercenaries to teach them the art of unity, of moving like a single body instead of scattered limbs. Shield walls that locked like iron jaws. Coordinated strikes that landed with the precision of a blacksmith's hammer. Defensive circles that could withstand cavalry. And yet, Magnus never stripped away the madness that made Vikings feared. Instead, he sanctified it. Monks and priests walked among the warriors, blessing every blade, every shield, every meal. Morning began with prayer. Evening ended with hymns. And in between, the men learned to let their rage fuse with faith, to see every strike of the axe as an offering to God. They were trained not just to fight, but to believe that every death they dealt opened the gates of heaven wider. These were not men preparing for war. These were zealots preparing for martyrdom. An army sculpted by fire, faith, and the terrible will of a king who dreamed of writing his name across the sands of the Holy Land. If this story already has you hooked, let us know by liking this video and telling us where you're watching from. It helps us bring more forgotten chronicles like this to life. And so, when Magnus gathered his chosen 800, the world did not yet know that something monstrous had been born. Something that was not entirely Viking, nor entirely Christian, but a fusion darker and deadlier than either. They would set sail not as men seeking plunder, but as instruments of divine wrath. Their journey would take them across seas and kingdoms, sharpening their steel and their faith with every mile. And in the deserts of Jerusalem, their king's vision would finally be tested, in a storm of fire, blood, and terror. The fleet left Bergen under sails that caught not only the wind, but the weight of destiny. Their oaken ships groaned across the waves, carrying not merchants nor wanderers, but 800 men who had been remade into something the world had not seen before. With them went Magnus, his eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on visions of holy fire and desert conquest. Their first stop was the Arcadian Isles, harsh and windswept, a place where men learned to bend beneath no master but the sea. Here, Magnus gathered mercenaries accustomed to fighting in climates beyond the cold north. These men were rough, hardened by storms, and they added another edge to the Viking blade. The voyage pressed southward, and the air grew warmer, the seas less forgiving. Spain awaited, a land torn between cross and crescent. The Vikings did not pass silently. They fought skirmishes against Muslim raiders along the Iberian coasts. These clashes were not battles of glory, but crucibles of learning. Here the Norsemen first tasted the sting of mounted archers, the sudden swoop of cavalry cutting from nowhere, and the long-range precision of foes who did not fight like Saxons or Danes. For every drop of blood spilled, knowledge was taken. They learned the rhythms of desert-born warfare, speed, mobility, the way the sun itself could be a weapon, blinding eyes and sapping strength. Magnus knew these lessons mattered more than victories. Every clash was a rehearsal, every wound a teacher. His men did not simply endure, they adapted. They discovered that fanaticism was their hidden blade, a force their enemies did not understand. Against men who fought for kings or coin, the Viking zeal burned like a madness, and it terrified those who faced it. Winter drove them east, to the glittering walls of Constantinople. Here, Magnus traded not just silver, but allegiance. The Byzantines, masters of strategy and refinement, welcomed the northern warriors as useful allies. From them, Magnus acquired armor forged to withstand the piercing arrows of the East, and weapons designed for precision as much as brutality. But more than steel, he gained a secret, a substance whispered about in fear, guarded as though it were holy. The Byzantines called it fire, though it behaved like no earthly flame. It clung, it consumed, it raged even against water. Greek fire. In the hands of Magnus and his zealots, it became not merely a weapon, but a prophecy. For fire, like faith, could not be extinguished once unleashed. From Constantinople, they sailed toward their destiny. Each mile carried whispers ahead of them. Rumors spread across trade routes and caravans. Stories of pale northern demons, men who fought like wolves, who did not break, who laughed in the face of death. Their reputation sailed faster than their ships, reaching the ears of emirs and commanders who guarded the Holy Land. By the time their fleet cut through the waves toward the Levant, their name was no longer unknown. It was a shadow creeping across maps, a warning that terror itself had come by sea. And so the Muslim commanders began to prepare. Abu Nasr, master of Jerusalem's defense, assembled his host. 40,000 he would bring. Horsemen who could strike like thunder, archers who could blot out the sun, infantry that could smother any resistance beneath sheer numbers. To him, the coming clash would not be war. It would be the crushing of an insect beneath a mountain. But he had not yet seen them. He had not yet stood on the sands where faith and madness joined hands. By the time they reached Jerusalem, the Vikings were no longer seen as raiders, but as a plague carried on the sea. If you're captivated already, if this journey from the cold fjords to the burning desert feels like the edge of a nightmare you cannot look away from, I invite you to stay with us here on Cursed Chronicles. Subscribe now, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from, because this is only the beginning, and what waits in the desert is darker still. In the heart of Jerusalem's defense stood a man whose name carried weight like iron. Emir Abu Nasr, commander of armies, heir to generations of warriors who had carved their power into the desert sands. To his followers, he was not merely a leader but a certainty, a living embodiment of strategy and discipline. Where Abu Nasr stood, armies gathered. Where he pointed, nations trembled. And when word reached him of the northern intruders, he did not hesitate. He would answer 800 with 40,000. His host was not a rabble, but a force crafted for dominance. Cavalry formed the pride of his strength. Thousands of horsemen, armored and disciplined, bred to strike with the fury of thunder. They had broken crusaders, raiders, and rebels alike. Alongside them rode mounted archers, men whose arrows could turn daylight into a storm of steel, trained to fire at full gallop, their precision unmatched. Behind them marched endless infantry, serried ranks of spearmen and swordsmen who could smother resistance by sheer weight of bodies. Siege engines followed, dragged across the sands, prepared to crack fortresses and crush enemies who thought stone walls could save them. The scale was staggering. When Abu Nasr's army moved, it was as if the desert itself had awakened. The ground quaked beneath the hooves and boots of 40,000. Dust rose like smoke across the horizon. The clash of armor, the blare of war horns, the chant of prayers woven into the march, all of it merged into a sound too vast for the human ear to contain. Against this ocean of men and beasts, what were 800? A shadow, a whisper soon to be drowned beneath a roar. Abu Nasr's plan was simple, one he had perfected many times before. He would encircle the northerners, pen them in like cattle awaiting slaughter. Arrows would fall in waves, softening their defense, breaking their shields, piercing their flesh. Then the cavalry would thunder forward, smashing what remained of their spirit, driving them to panic. And finally, the infantry would close in, crushing them under numbers too vast to resist. It would be, in his mind, an execution, not a battle. Yet from his vantage point, he could not see what lay within that Viking square. He saw men, yes, only men. Hardened perhaps, but still flesh and blood. What he did not see was the fire stitched into their souls, the faith that had been sharpened into something beyond reason. Where he saw weakness, they saw martyrdom. Where he saw inevitable defeat, they saw divine purpose. And so two forces approached one another under the burning sky. One vast and certain of its triumph, the other small but carrying within it a darkness that could not be measured by numbers. The desert was silent for one final breath, as if the world itself waited to see what would unfold. What would you have done, facing 40,000 with just 800 at your side? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next cursed tale we uncover. At dawn the silence broke. The desert trembled with the first blast of Saracen war horns, deep and guttural, rolling across the dunes like the roar of a living beast. The earth quaked beneath the surge of cavalry as Abu Nasr unleashed his opening strike. Thousands of riders thundered forward, scimitars flashing in the rising sun, banners snapping in the wind. From a distance it looked like a tidal wave of flesh and steel, unstoppable, merciless, ready to wash over the tiny Viking square and crush it into dust. The 800 did not flinch. They did not raise their voices in fear or scatter before the storm. Instead, something unthinkable happened. The Viking formation broke apart, not in panic, but in eerie precision. Lines dissolved into circles, 8 in total, 100 men in each, spreading like rings carved into the desert floor. To the Saracen riders, it looked like madness. To the men who had trained for this moment, it was the execution of a design perfected through months of brutal preparation. The horsemen expected a solid line to smash through. Instead, they found themselves riding into spaces between circles, funneled inward, split apart, their momentum shattered. Behind them, the circles closed like jaws, trapping them in killing grounds. Horses reared in confusion. Men shouted in panic as steel struck from every direction. The Vikings fought not as individuals, but as a single, unyielding machine. Every shield deflected into an opening for an axe. Every strike was followed by another. Their movements, drilled to the point of obsession, gave the illusion of telepathy. But it was not their skill alone that froze the hearts of the cavalry. It was their eyes. The riders who looked into the faces of these northerners saw no fear, no hesitation, not even the instinct to survive. They saw men already dead, men who welcomed the blade, who fought not to escape death but to embrace it. Berserkers had long haunted European battlefields, but this was something more. This was berserker fury baptized in holy fire, fanaticism carved into flesh and spirit until every Viking became an executioner who believed his place in paradise was bought with every stroke of his weapon. The first wave of cavalry disintegrated in chaos. Horses collapsed, dragged down by hooked spears. Riders screamed as axes split them from shoulder to breastplate. Dust and blood mingled in the air until the desert stank of iron and fear. In minutes, what should have been an unstoppable charge turned into slaughter. Abu Nazar, watching from his command, saw nearly 1,000 of his finest riders cut down in the opening clash. Yet he was not alarmed, not yet. Numbers, he told himself, would win the day. Numbers always had. But for those on the ground, the truth was already unraveling. Against 800, the strength of 40,000 had met its first fracture. If this tactic surprised you as much as it surprised their enemies, hit the like button. It helps us spread these lost stories across the world. Abu Nazar was not a man easily shaken. Cavalry had failed, yes, but he believed arrows would succeed where hooves had faltered. With a wave of his arm, he summoned the mounted archers forward. Thousands of riders spread in a wide circle, bows drawn, the desert wind carrying the creak of taut strings. A black storm rose into the sky, and then the heavens broke open. Arrows fell in sheets, blotting out the sun, hissing down like rain upon the Viking circles. The northerners did not scatter. At the signal, shields locked overhead, walls of iron tilting inward to form makeshift roofs. Beneath them, the Vikings crouched, unyielding, the ground shuddering as arrows hammered against their defenses. The desert rang with the sound of steel on wood, shafts splintering, points lodging deep into layered shields. When one man fell, another stepped into his place. For long minutes, the rain of death continued, until the sands were blackened with arrows and the air was thick with dust. But these men had not come to the desert unprepared. During the night before battle, they had dragged the bodies of fallen foes and gathered scraps of timber, fashioning low barricades around their circles. Now they crouched behind this patchwork fortress, patient as predators, waiting for the storm to pass. When it did, their response was not silence. It was hell itself. From within the circles, long spears thrust outward, their tips sharpened and cruelly hooked. Riders who pressed too close were dragged screaming from their saddles, torn from horses and thrown to the sand where axes fell like thunderbolts. More chilling still was what the Vikings had carried from Constantinople. They lifted clay jars wrapped in cloth, their mouths stuffed with pitch. With firebrands they lit the rags, and then hurled them outward. The projectiles arced through the air and burst upon the ground, erupting in flames that clung and crawled. This was no ordinary fire. It fed upon cloth and armor alike, a living flame that water could not kill. The Saracen archers, trained to strike terror into others, now faced it themselves. Horses bucked and screamed as fire clung to their hides. Men toppled, writhing, their cries piercing the battlefield. Those who survived found themselves cut down by warriors who seemed to grow stronger with every death, as though each enemy slain dragged them deeper into their holy frenzy. Abu Nazar's second assault collapsed, not from lack of numbers, but from the spreading sickness of fear. His archers, masters of distance and death, had been brought down by men who refused to yield, who fought as if pain and flame were nothing but steps toward paradise. If you're just joining us here on Cursed Chronicles, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know. By midday, the desert sun had become a furnace. Heat shimmered in the air, blurring the horizon, baking the blood-soaked sand until it stank of iron and ash. Twice Abu Nazar had struck, and twice his forces had recoiled in disbelief. Yet he refused to accept the unthinkable, that 800 men could withstand him. So he turned to his greatest weapon, sheer weight of numbers. The order was given, and with it the ground began to quake. 20,000 infantry surged forward in a wave that stretched from horizon to horizon, spears raised, shields glinting, their collective roar rolling across the desert like thunder. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Where cavalry and arrows had failed, bodies alone would succeed. A tide of men would smother the northerners, grinding them into dust beneath the pressure of overwhelming flesh and steel. But the Vikings had been waiting for this. For hours they had held their circles, conserving their strength, guarding something hidden, something darker than anything yet unleashed. When the infantry closed to within 50 paces, Magnus gave the signal. A sudden flurry of movement broke out within the circles. Warriors produced jars of their most terrible weapon, the Byzantine fire, hoarded like treasure since Constantinople. With a roar, they hurled them outward. The sky seemed to catch flame. Dozens, then hundreds of incendiary projectiles arced high, their burning trails slicing across the sun-bleached air. And then the desert erupted. Rings of fire burst to life around each Viking position, walls of searing flame that clung to armor, devoured cloth, and leapt hungrily into the desert wind. The effect was immediate, catastrophic. The charging infantry broke ranks in terror, men screaming as fire licked up their legs, clinging even as they rolled in the sand. Panic spread like a plague. Soldiers stumbled into one another, tripping over corpses, trampling comrades as they fled the inferno. The air filled with the stench of burning flesh, with shrieks so piercing they seemed to tear at the mind itself. And in that chaos, the Vikings struck. No longer content to hold their circles, they burst outward with savage fury. Many were bleeding, some aflame themselves, yet they charged as if guided by something greater than life. They cut through the broken lines like wolves tearing into a scattered herd, axes rising and falling, spears plunging, shields smashing bone and blade alike. To the Saracen infantry, it no longer felt like battle. It felt like nightmare. The 800 did not fight like men. They fought like phantoms, like demons conjured from fire and blood, creatures who welcomed their own deaths as eagerly as they dealt it to others. For every Viking that fell, 10 men were dragged down with him. The more they bled, the stronger their frenzy grew, until terror outweighed numbers, until the vast host of Abu Nasr faltered. The desert that morning had been filled with confidence, an army of 40,000 certain of an easy victory. By afternoon, it was filled with fire and madness, a slaughterhouse without walls. If you're just joining us on Chronicles, hit subscribe now, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This battle is only growing darker, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Abu Nasr could no longer ignore the truth. His cavalry shattered, his archers broken, his infantry scorched and scattered. Yet still the Northerners stood, 800 shadows cutting through the heart of his 40,000. What remained of his vast army looked not like conquerors, but like prey. And so the emir reached for his final card, the blade he believed no man could withstand. He summoned his guard. 2,000 veterans, handpicked over years of war. Men hardened in the blood of countless campaigns, clad in the finest armor Damascus and Cairo could forge. These were the wolves of his host, warriors who had faced crusaders, Byzantines, and Seljuks, and never once bowed. If anyone could bring Magnus Barefoot to his knees, it was them. Their task was simple: cut the head from the beast, kill Magnus, and watch the rest collapse. The clash was unlike anything the desert had yet seen. The emir's guard advanced in perfect formation, shields locked, blades gleaming, their chants rising into the heat. Across from them stood Magnus and his chosen. They were fewer, their bodies bloodied, but their eyes burned with a frenzy that no exhaustion could quench. At their center towered Magnus himself, over 2 meters tall, his presence alone larger than life, wielding a double-headed axe said to have been blessed by holy hands. In that moment he was not merely a king, but a symbol, the embodiment of belief sharpened into a weapon. The guards met the Vikings in a storm of steel. For an hour the desert rang with the clang of iron, the crack of bone, the roar of men who refused to yield. Each side fought as if the fate of the world rested on their blades. Abu Nasr's veterans struck with skill honed by years of training, but the Northerners answered with a ferocity that seemed inhuman, their wounds ignored, their deaths transformed into fuel for those who remained. Then came the duel. Amidst the chaos, Abu Nasr himself rode forward, seeking Magnus. He dismounted, drawing his sword, its blade catching the sun like a shard of fire. Across from him, Magnus raised his axe, its edge already dark with blood. The battlefield seemed to fall silent, as if thousands held their breath. The emir was a master of his art, trained in Damascus by the greatest swordsman of his age. He struck with precision, with elegance born of endless duels. But Magnus fought with something no school could teach: the unshakable conviction that each swing was guided by the will of heaven itself. His strikes were brutal, primal, yet relentless. Every blow meant not just to kill, but to end. Steel clashed against steel, sparks leaping in the burning air. For minutes they circled, locked in combat, one man wielding perfect skill, the other unbreakable belief. And then belief outlasted skill. Magnus' axe fell, and with it the emir. His body struck the sand, lifeless, and in that instant, 40,000 men felt the ground vanish beneath them. Their commander was gone. Their shield was broken. The battle, once certain, had turned into nightmare. The desert winds carried not the roar of victory, but the whisper of terror. What would you have done, standing amidst the ashes of 40,000 with only 800 at your back? Share your thoughts below, and stay with us here on Cursed Chronicles by subscribing. because what follows this duel is darker than anything yet witnessed on that cursed battlefield. The fall of Abu Nasr was more than the death of a man. It was the shattering of an idea. His soldiers had marched into the desert certain of their triumph, certain that sheer numbers would smother the pale invaders. But when their emir's body struck the sand, that certainty bled out with him. What began as discipline dissolved into panic. 40,000 men, once an army, now became a tide of chaos. At first, it was hesitation, ranks faltering, formations loosening, eyes glancing to the fallen leader who would never rise again. Then hesitation turned to fear. Fear became contagion, leaping from man to man faster than any fire could spread. Cries of command were drowned out by the thunder of boots as soldiers turned to run, shoving past their comrades in blind desperation. Order collapsed into madness. Warriors trampled their own brothers in the rush to escape, throwing down weapons, abandoning shields, fleeing not just the battle, but the vision of 800 northern fanatics who fought as if death itself were their ally. Magnus saw it happen, and his voice cut through the desert like a blade. No survivors. His order was not tactical. It was not born of strategy or necessity. It was a creed, a ritual of annihilation. If God had given them this victory, then mercy had no place in it. The enemy would not be defeated, they would be erased. The pursuit began. For 3 days, the Vikings hunted the broken army across the burning wastelands. Groups of fugitives tried to flee under cover of night, but the northerners were relentless, driving them into traps, springing ambushes, cutting off every escape. The massacre no longer resembled war. It had become ritual slaughter. Every captured man was executed with prayers whispered over his body, every strike of the axe framed as divine work. On the first day, 10,000 fell. On the second, 15,000 more. By the third, the desert was littered with corpses, the sand dark with blood, the air heavy with the stench of decay. Of the 40,000 who had marched with Abu Nasr, only fragments remained, scattered and broken. From the 800, just 270 had perished, a staggering loss, but nothing compared to the mountains of bodies left behind. It was not a victory. It was extermination. The desert itself seemed to groan under the weight of it, a cursed memory carved into the earth. And for those who lived to tell the tale, the Vikings ceased to be men. They became phantoms of fire and iron, executioners in human skin, demons of the north who had come to cleanse the land in blood. If this battle has shocked you as much as it did us while uncovering it, don't forget to subscribe to Curse Chronicles and share where you're watching from in the comments. What you have heard is not the end, but the beginning, for the legacy of this massacre would echo across centuries, shaping wars yet to come. Word of the massacre did not remain buried in the desert sands. It raced outward along trade routes, whispered in caravan camps, carried by trembling survivors who spoke of pale demons wielding fire that could not be quenched. In Damascus, men who had boasted of their armies now sat in silence. In Cairo, commanders who had believed themselves untouchable now tasted fear. In Baghdad, the very seat of power shuddered at the thought that 800 men had destroyed one of the strongest hosts the region could muster. Magnus wasted no time. With the survivors of his force, barely 500 men, he pressed his advantage. Their reputation had become a weapon sharper than any axe. Cities that once stood defiant now surrendered without a single blow. Fortresses lowered their banners at the mere rumor of their approach. Local Christian communities, long oppressed, rose to join them, swelling their number to several thousand. Yet even with reinforcements, Magnus did not lead a traditional campaign. He waged a war of terror. Every clash, no matter how small, was turned into legend. Victories were magnified into myth. Enemies who resisted were exterminated without mercy, their corpses left as warnings to others. In Europe, the tale reached eager ears. Pilgrims and chroniclers carried word of Magnus Barefoot across the continent, each retelling more vivid than the last. Some claimed angels fought beside the Vikings, their wings turning aside arrows. Others swore their armor was unpierceable, consecrated by God himself. The truth mattered little. The story itself was enough. Pope Urban II, preparing to summon the First Crusade, pointed to this miracle as proof that divine favor rested on Christian arms. If 800 zealots could shatter 40,000, what might tens of thousands of knights achieve? But beneath the triumph lay something darker. Magnus had set a precedent that would ripple through centuries. The Vikings had shown that holy war permitted anything: fire without mercy, slaughter without limit, annihilation justified by faith. Later crusaders copied their methods. Terror as a weapon, annihilation as strategy, fanaticism as fuel. The massacre of Jerusalem became not just a legend of victory, but a blueprint for atrocity. Magnus himself did not live to see the shadows he cast. He fell in 1069, struck down in battle near Antioch. Yet death did not silence his name. In Scandinavia, his surviving warriors were hailed as saints of the sword. Songs were sung, churches were raised, and young men swore oaths beneath the memory of the Jerusalem massacre. Across Europe, the tale spread like wildfire, fanning the flames of the Crusades. In the Muslim world, the memory lingered as a curse, a haunting reminder of what conviction could unleash. Even now, nearly 1,000 years later, the question remains. Did those 800 triumph because of discipline, because of weapons, because of fire? Or did they triumph because they believed, with every breath, with every wound, with every drop of blood, that they were chosen by God to do the impossible? Their story is both awe and horror. A reminder that numbers alone do not decide battles, that sometimes belief itself can become the sharpest weapon of all. Stay with us here on Cursed Chronicles. Subscribe now, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Because the shadows of history hold many more curses, and each one waits to be told. The massacre in the desert was not only a turning point in battle, it was a revelation of the human condition. The Vikings did not triumph because they were stronger or more numerous. They triumphed because they carried something invisible, something that weighed heavier than steel. Conviction. To their enemies, they seemed inhuman because they no longer valued what men fear most, survival. To them, death was not an ending but an ascension, and that belief gave them a freedom that no strategy could replicate. Numbers crumbled before faith. 40,000 men, drilled and armed, became a tide of panic once the illusion of certainty broke. 800 fanatics, bound by loyalty, belief, and the hunger for martyrdom, stood as one until the earth itself seemed to bend in their favor. It was a lesson commanders across Christendom would not forget. From this moment forward, the idea of the holy warrior, men who fused discipline with absolute faith, would spread like wildfire. Orders such as the Templars and the Hospitallers would be born in its shadow, each one a reflection of Magnus' army, each one proof that conviction could be forged into something sharper than any blade. But there was another lesson darker, more haunting. Fanaticism does not choose sides. It can inspire the most impossible feats, but it can also unleash the worst atrocities. The Vikings believed themselves instruments of God, yet to their enemies they were demons loosed upon the earth. Both views held truth. For what they accomplished was extraordinary, and what they committed was monstrous. The story spread, not just as fact but as legend. It became a weapon in its own right. Chroniclers in Europe painted the battle as divine proof that heaven favored the cross. Survivors in the East spoke of it as a curse, a nightmare etched into memory. Propaganda magnified it until it no longer mattered what truly happened. What mattered was belief, and belief reshaped history. Cities surrendered at whispers, armies faltered before fighting, and recruits flocked to banners because the story itself had already decided the outcome. And so the massacre of Jerusalem stands both as warning and inspiration. It reveals that the limits of humanity are not always physical, but psychological. That men can endure fire, wounds, and despair when they are convinced their suffering is sacred. That terror spreads faster than swords. And that reputation can be a weapon deadlier than armies. Think of it. 800 against 40,000. The world would say it was impossible. And yet it happened. The desert still carries that echo, a reminder that faith can move more than mountains. It can move armies. It can unmake certainty. It can bend the course of nations. Magnus Barefoot and his zealots became more than men in that moment. They became a symbol, cursed and exalted at once, their story drifting across centuries to remind us of the fragile line between devotion and destruction. Stay with us here on Cursed Chronicles. Subscribe, and share in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Because this was only one of many tales carved into history's darkest shadows, and the next is waiting to be told.